Okay, welcome to virtual video number 2. This is a human fieldwork video, so I'm going to introduce you to Southwold's Human Geography in this video, and at the end of the video I'll also then introduce you to some more human geography fieldwork techniques. So it's kind of a bit two-part really. The first part of it is going to be talking to you about what's where and what's what in Southwold and what the human geography issues are, and as I said, we'll then talk about and discuss a range of different human geography fieldwork methods towards the second part of this video. So get yourself nice and comfy, settle in, and I'm sorry that you've got to put out of my voice a lot. I promise that when you come to Southwold, I won't talk much at you at all, and you won't have to put up with my voice all that much at all. The nature of the way in which these courses are being done is obviously it's my job at the moment to give you as much information as I can about Southwold and about the fieldwork that you can do here. So inevitably you're going to be kind of bombarded by information and my voice over the next hour or so. So one of the things you might need, and it might be useful for you to have at this stage, you might have an electronic version of this, or you might have a hard copy of it, but throughout this presentation I'm going to refer to some things which are in the booklet that is provided to you, the Fieldwork and Southwold booklet. So it might just be worth you having that with you so you can flick through it to reference as I talk about various things in it. Okay, so just a reminder that this is one of 3 videos that you'll probably ultimately end up watching. You've hopefully already seen the first one. The second one then was a choice between focusing on either the physical aspects of Southwold or the human aspects of Southwold. So this is the human geography video number 2. And once you've watched this, I would then encourage you to watch the 4th video. It's called Virtual Video 4, which is all about kind of preparing for your fieldwork day and kind of making sure that you arrive with what you need in terms of your methodologies and your design for the day kind of mapped out. Okay, so the first job of this video is to try and make you familiar with Southwold town and its residential streets. It's not a very big place, Southwold, and it is a place that you'll quite quickly get your bearings in, but obviously you're not benefiting from a kind of an orientation day where you come to Southwold and you have a day where you just get to know the place like a lot of students on our courses do. So your introduction to Southwold streets is going to be done virtually. So I'm going to talk through a number of different slides now with the essence really to give you more of an understanding about Southwold's town, its urban geography, and also the issues that you can investigate in this place. So when you look at Southwold, and when you look at an image like this, which is taken just actually above the beach, looking back inland to Southwold seafront, one of the things that you think, or that you might be kind of forgiven for thinking, is that this is a place that doesn't look as if it's modernised. It doesn't look as if it's particularly gone through any recent changes. It doesn't look as if it's a place that would necessarily have all that many challenges because it looks fairly affluent. The lives of people here, I imagine, would be probably fairly comfortable. They've got nice houses. They've got a nice kind of environment in which they're based. So you might think that this is a strange place to study human geography and certainly to investigate change and challenges. But it isn't. It is an excellent place for human geography. Southwold as a town has actually got just as much human geography opportunities as its coastline presents. And this is a place where there are a wide variety of really relevant human geography issues that can be investigated. So on the screen now, we've got 4 images. On the left-hand side, we've got images taken from the late 19th century. And on the right-hand side, we've got images taken from the early 21st century. So those images are over 100 years apart. The one on the top, those top 2, is actually taken from the Market Square in Southwold's kind of central business district. Not that Southwold really has a CBD, but this is kind of Southwold's main retail street. And the image right in the centre there is an old bank, and on the left is a greengrocer's. Now, below that, we've also got Southwold's other end of the high street, and on the right-hand side in the distance is WH Smith's and the fish and chip shop, which we'll probably get to know. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight with these images is that physically, when you look at Southwold's houses and the architecture within the town, this is somewhere that doesn't look as if it's experiencing change, doesn't look as if it's experiencing any kind of significant modernisation. And actually, the look of Southwold is something which has been retained and preserved over time, and it hasn't changed all that much at all. So as I say, you might be thinking this is a strange place for studying human geography, change over time and changing identity and themes like that. But actually, one of the things that is happening in Southwold is a bit more discreet, and most visitors to the town wouldn't perhaps be aware of it. And I think probably most visitors to Southwold would be forgiven for walking along the streets and down the high street and thinking that this is a town that's successful. This is a town that is bustling and thriving and popular and would offer a really good quality of living to its residents. But actually, when you scratch away at the surface of what's going on at Southwold, this is a place that has got real geography challenges, and it's got lots of sustainability issues in terms of its community into the future. And it has definitely got conflicts and challenges from a geographical perspective. So one of the things that I want to just highlight to you is you might be able to see in that bottom right-hand image there that I've highlighted something in the window. Now that thing in the window is a sticker which has got a logo on it of one of the local estate agents. Now, throughout Southwold's streets, not just on its high street, but predominantly in the residential streets, you'll notice, if you are made aware of these little logos dotting windows, sometimes located next to doors or sometimes located on boards outside the front of houses. And these logos represent, as I say, the local letting agents or estate agents in the town. And what they're showing is actually they're showing properties around the town which are available to be rented. Now, you might not think that's particularly significant, but the extent to which Southwold's properties can be rented is something which is significant. And it's something which fundamentally underlines the whole, well, quite a number of Southwold's human geography issues. So I'm going to try and explain that in a little bit more detail and try to kind of, as simply as I can, explain the human geography challenges that Southwold faces, largely as a result of these holiday rentals. So on the screen at the moment, you have an extract from a speech which was given by our local town councillor, a chap called David Bevan, who's quite prominent around the town, who actually lives at the bottom of the high street, and you're fairly likely to see him, I'd have thought, at some point during your visit. David's quite a recognisable chap. He obviously represents the local interests, and he normally does that in kind of the local region. But there are times when he goes further afield, and this is actually an extract from a speech which he gave in Westminster. And he stood up and he spoke about the challenges facing his town of Southwold. Now, the first part of that, in kind of that deeper purple colour, is where he was talking about things within Southwold that he's proud of and that he particularly likes. He's really keen on going out onto the common and watching the rugby teams playing on Saturday afternoon. He likes the fact that he can wander down to the harbour and buy fish which is being caught locally. We have this big common, a big open area of land that anyone can walk across, and it's great for dog walking. There's a golf course that runs through it as well. The sun comes up first on the East Anglian coast before obviously any other part of the country, and he quite likes that, and he boasts about it. And also he's quite keen on the fact that we've got a brewery in the heart of our town which has been there for over 150 years, and we've got lots of pubs locally where you can drink their produce. So he started initially talking about the positive aspects of Southwold, but then his speech turned into a more kind of perhaps negative, more sinister tone. And he then started saying, however, in the last 20 years, our population has halved. And he went on to say that we've lost our hospital, our police and our fire station. And he listed some of the services that have recently closed. There are a number of other services in addition to that which are increasingly challenged, and a number of them that have closed as well. And then he made this statement, which is in big in the middle of that page. It says 60% of our houses are second homes. Now, David made that statement based on information which has come from the 2011 national census, which is the latest published census result that he had at that time. Now, at that point, it was clear that 60% of the properties, the residential properties in Southwold, were occupied by people who use those properties as their second address or their second home. So they might have their first primary address in somewhere like London or Norwich or Ipswich. The house that they owned in Southwold was their second home. Now, that's based on 2011 data. In the years since he made this statement, or that evidence was gathered, many people locally, including the local council and including us who investigate this every week, are very confident that that figure has increased. And that figure realistically now stands more like 70% to 75%. So we're talking about 3 out of every 4 houses in Southwold currently being a second home. Now that has a massive impact upon the town in the way in which the community functions, the way in which community organisations are able to work and function, but also the whole nature and identity of the high street and Southwold's function as a whole. So this is a town which has a significant challenge currently, and that challenge is catering towards a really transient kind of part-time population, which is made up of a lot of second homeowners and a declining and ever kind of dwindling proportion of local people. So he went on to say 6 out of 10 homes are not permanently lived in. Our young families can't afford to live in a town anymore. The reason for that is that Southwold is a place that has become incredibly popular to buy property. I think I mentioned in the first video that it's now the 3rd most expensive coastal community in the country to buy property. So whenever a property in Southwold comes up for sale, there's incredible demand for that property. And the result of that increased demand essentially inflates house prices. So house prices in Southwold are incredibly expensive. So expensive that local young people can't really afford to buy property in this town. And that prices them out of the housing market here. And it means that when a property does come up for sale, it's normally bought by somebody who's very affluent and who can afford it. And they're often people that work and generally live away from Southwold. And they buy it as a second home kind of holiday destination. So that's pricing young people out of the town. He went on to say that even the lifeboat crew can't afford to live inland. And most people that work in Southwold shops and pubs and services aren't able to live in a town, and they'll commute here in the morning. So he went on to say that second homes are everywhere. And a problem of second home ownership is that there is actually a legal loophole that if you register your second home as a holiday rental, then you don't pay the same amount of council tax that you would normally pay on a residential property. And so he went on to say that the council is losing up to £500,000, perhaps even more now, per year, as a result of all of these holiday rentals or second homes not paying the same amount of council tax that they normally would. So that has an impact on council spending. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. But he finished off by saying, our little town is in trouble, it is changing, and he doesn't like it. Okay, so one of the things that David Bevan highlighted was the fact that local people are being priced out of Southwold because of the inflated house prices here. Now, on the left here is a really interesting map that is taken from rightmove.co.uk, and actually websites like Rightmove and Zoopla are really useful for urban geography studies. They've got all sorts of information, and this here is a map that you can get off Rightmove that shows the property sales that have occurred in the last 5 years. You can see I've added that criteria onto the left-hand side tick box. So this is showing property sales in Southwold in the last 5 years, and the colour of the dot is showing showing how much that property is sold for, but also obviously where that property was sold. So if you look at the key at the bottom there, you can see that within Southwold, most of the houses that have been sold are kind of a dark red or like a very dark red, maroon, even black. So a number of them are over £1 million. A number of them are over £750,000, and the vast majority of them are at least over £500,000. There are an odd few that are yellow, but those yellow ones will literally be garages. There'll be tiny little spaces. That's still in Southwold, a garage. I saw one this week. The garage in Southwold was on the market for £250,000, literally the size of a shed that you can fit one car in Southwold goes for £250,000. So there's a good figure on the left-hand side of that screen that's worth noting, and is also worth perhaps checking when you come just to get the latest average. But at the time of me doing this presentation, this was the current average house price in Southwold. £724,000 was the overall average house price in Southwold. And actually, a number of the houses in Southwold are pretty average. There's nothing particularly special about them. A lot of them are townhouses, are terraced houses, they're semis. They're not massively grand in terms of the scale of them and how big they are. A number of them don't have gardens, but actually on average, properties in Southwold are selling £750,000. There are a number of them that will sell way in excess of that, and a number of Southwold's grander properties, generally to the south of the map there, will easily go for over £1 million. So, as David Bevan highlighted, the impact of this is significant because it's affecting the community, the permanent community of Southwold. And that population pyramid there that you can see above my head, that's a population pyramid representing the age demographic or the age makeup of Southwold. And it was done in 2011, again on the last census. What you can see there is a real distortion and an imbalance towards older people to younger people. So this is a pyramid reflecting Southwold's permanent residents, of which only about 30 or 40% of the houses are including permanent residents. But you can see there that there's a significant proportion of older people, and there's actually hardly anyone really under the age of 50. So there's a real void, a real lack of young families, young people, children, and people in those age brackets. And therefore, that has a significant impact on the sustainability of the community to offer things like community events, community clubs, things like youth clubs, sports teams. Southwold's rugby team, for instance, there are very few people that play for Southwold's rugby team that actually live in the town. A number of them will come from the surrounding towns and villages to play for the town. Things like brownies and cubs, groups like that. Even things like pantomime performances in Southwold that are designed and catering towards a younger audience are very difficult to do in this town because of the dwindling young population. The other impact of having an older population is that if that is the population pyramid from 2011, one of the things that inevitably will have happened in the last 10, 11, 12 years or so since that pyramid was created is that a number of those people towards the top of that pyramid will have unfortunately died, or maybe have moved into care homes and will have moved out of their properties. So what I want to show you is something that we've put together over the last couple of years, which is a very simplistic flow diagram, which won't blow your mind at all. It's pretty straightforward to understand. But the idea of showing it to you is to kind of basically get the gist of what's happening in terms of Southwold's human geography as a result of this change, which is happening as a result of the increased amount of second homeowners in Southwold. Okay, so here it is. This is Southwold's change flow diagram. As I said, it's not particularly groundbreaking, but it's that thing in the middle there. And I'm going to start at the top. In 2011, we know this based on the official census data that has been released. And we know that of the houses in Southwold, which there are about 1,300 houses in Southwold, we know that 60% of them in 2011 were registered as second home properties. 32% of them were owned and occupied by people who are retired residents. And then 8% of them in 2011 were occupied by people who have dependent children, and that's what we class as families. So we know that of that proportion and that makeup of people, that in the last 10 years, obviously those people who are older, a number of them will have either died, unfortunately, or moved away from the properties that they were living in. So when that happens, that property is normally put on the market and is sold. So, imagine if you were somebody that inherited a property in Southwold that one of your elderly relatives had left to you. You've got an option, I suppose. You've got a couple of choices. You can either move into Southwold, or you might think, actually, this is the third most expensive place in the whole country to buy coastal property. I'm going to put it on the market and cash in. And you might then choose to kind of, make the steps towards selling the property. So generally what happens when retired residents move out of their properties in Southwold is they tend then to make their ways onto the housing market. So you see the for sale sign going up. But when that property is sold, which doesn't normally take very long at all, the for sale sign comes down, and then you see the beginnings of something called gentrification. Now, those properties are normally bought by people who are wealthy, affluent people, generally from places like London or Norwich or Cambridge, Ipswich, as I say, but people that can afford to buy a property in somewhere where the house prices are so inflated. And they are generally moving to Southwold or buying a property in Southwold as a second home property. So the proportion of second homes over the 10-year gap between the last two censuses, we're expecting will have increased up to about 70%, which is what you can see on that kind of second bar on the flow diagram there. So we kind of have about three different types of second homeowner, really. There are people who will buy a property in Southwold as a second home, and they will choose to perhaps use it at weekends, maybe for a few weeks in the summer, a few weeks maybe over the Christmas holidays and Easter. And then when they're not using it, they would then potentially think about how they could make money from that property. And a number of those people would go to the estate agents on the high street, and they might say, hi, I own number 10 Marlborough Road. I'm going to use it for these 8 weeks of the year, but for those weeks that I'm not using it, I would like you to advertise it on your website as being available to rent, and I would like you to organise for people to use it when we're not using it. Now, that can be a very profitable thing for homeowners in Southwold to do. A lot of the properties in Southwold, if you rent them out for a week, will be at least £800, very often £1,000 a week. If you're looking at the summer months, you're talking about maybe more like £1,500 a week to rent perhaps a 3 or a 4-bedroom property in Southwold. So if you can rent out your property for 40 weeks a year at an average of £1,000 a week, then you can make £40,000 a year from the income that is generated by your house being used when you're not using it. Obviously, the estate agents in the town will probably take a cut, maybe 20 to 25%, but nevertheless, it still might be possible that you're able to make £25,000 to £30,000 a year from renting out your property. And that's why a lot of second home owners will allow their house to be a holiday rental when they're not using it. And it's those properties that you see the logos on the doors, or you might see a key safe box next to the door, and that indicates that that building is a second home initially, but also it's a second home that is available to be rented, and therefore would class it as a holiday home as well. So we have initially those type of second home owners, the ones that are happy to rent their property out as a holiday let when they're not using it. Now, some second home owners are wealthy enough that they don't actually need to do that. And they might think, I don't want anyone else using my home when I'm not in it. I don't want somebody using my cutlery or my crockery or my bathroom. And so actually, when they're not using their property, they'll just leave it empty. They'll pull down the shutters, close the curtains, lock the doors, and they'll vacate the property when they leave Southwold. And that building will then sit empty for the times that they're not using it, because they're wealthy enough that they don't need that income that they could potentially generate from renting it out. So we've got a second type of second homeowner, the one that doesn't have their home as a holiday rental. And unfortunately, we're seeing a third type of second homeowner as well. These owners don't actually use their property at all. So one of the things that has happened in recent years is that house prices have increased dramatically. And in places like Southwold, there's been a massive increase. I think I mentioned on a previous slide, there's been a 17% increase in the last 3 years alone of property prices in Southwold. So one of the things that we're seeing, unfortunately, in Southwold and probably other places around the country, is that people who can afford to, who may have a lump sum of money, maybe they've come into some inheritance or they've had a particular big bonus or something like that, if they work in banking or something like that, one of the things they could traditionally do is invest that money into stocks and shares or maybe a high interest savings account. But actually now property is seen as a really good bet, particularly in places like Southwold, where property prices are only increasing and are increasing dramatically. So actually some people are buying properties in Southwold and they're just literally sitting on that property. They're not doing anything with it. They're not renovating it. They're not moving in. They're not using it. And it might well be that come 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, that property's value has increased by 15 to 20%. And they've made a significant amount of money without actually doing anything, but just having their money invested in that property. So unfortunately, we see three types of new property owners in Southwold. Those people that are buying second homes to use as holiday rentals when they're not using it. Those wealthy people that are using the second homes exclusively for themselves. And the third type of people that are using the property to basically accrue money, to generate money for them over a certain time period. Generally then, if we go back to the first two types of people, the people that are using it as their second homes and are actually getting into the building, what tends to happen then, once they've invested pretty significantly in the price of the building in the first place, is that's not where the spending stops. The spending doesn't stop by them paying for the house. What they tend to then do is they tend to increase their investment and keep spending by renovating the property, Particularly this is needed if it's a property that's maybe bought off somebody that is perhaps elderly and it needs, real kind of modernising. So very often when the for sale signs come down outside these properties, you then see things like you can see on a screen here. You see scaffolding going up, you see skips arriving on the road, and you see loads and loads of white vans arriving, builders that are perhaps going in initially and knocking out kitchens and bathrooms, maybe knocking out interior walls. And then money is spent on basically jazzing up and renovating and improving those houses, whether it's kind of adding in new windows, maybe it's adding an extra room at the back, maybe it's converting a loft or the basement, but it's invested in upgrading those houses. So that is something which is called gentrification. Now, gentrification is a kind of a key process in human geography, and it's something which is happening in lots of cities and towns around the country. But I'd kind of stick my neck out to say that actually Southwold is one of the ultimate places to investigate the impacts of gentrification, because this is a town which in the last 15 to 20 years has almost overwhelmingly been gentrified in every single street. And as you walk down the streets, particularly the residential streets in Southwold, you get a real sense of wealth and of high quality property, because essentially all of those properties in the last 20 to 30 years have been bought by people with lots of money, and those people have poured money into gentrifying the houses. So actually, as you walk up and down the streets in Southwold, you get a real sense of this being an affluent place, of there being real wealth and significance to the owners that are here. And as I say, I would say that this is probably one of the best examples nationally of a town which has been gentrified. Now, the impact of that gentrification, I mean, short term is pretty good for builders locally. That's excellent in terms of generating work for builders, plumbers, electricians. So it's actually very beneficial. But there's a much broader kind of long-term impact that this almost irreversible kind of one-dimensional process of gentrification is having. So that's what those kind of bits are at the bottom of that flow diagram there. And I'm just going to talk through them a little bit to hopefully give you a bit more understanding as to what's happening. So environmentally, and we can kind of group the change into these three categories of environmentally, economic and socially, but environmentally, one of the positive changes that you'll see within Southwold, as I mentioned, is that overwhelmingly the properties here and just generally the feel of the town feels well loved, it feels well kept, well maintained. If you stand outside a property and just to look at it and to assess it, you'd think, yeah, pretty nice. This is nicely kept. And you'd struggle not to think that about any house in Southwold, that you stand outside, most of them you'd stand outside and think, yeah, it's nice, it's probably off the bubble too. And you get this overwhelming sense that, these buildings are very well maintained. There's money continually invested in keeping them looking good. And therefore we have the situation where private property in Southwold looks great, looks really good. But randomly then, not necessarily randomly, but we have a contrast. I mentioned on the previous slide that, or maybe a couple of slides before, but during Mr. Bevan's speech in Westminster, he highlighted the fact that actually one of the problems that Southwold Council has is they're actually losing out on council tax as a result of the increased properties in the town that are second homes. Now, as a result of Southwold Town Council losing out on council tax, they've got less money to spend locally on maintaining public spaces. So actually, one of the things you may not notice initially when you come to Southwold, but when you start looking a bit, more of the geography hat on, you'll definitely notice it, and I'll point it out to you anyhow. Southwold's public spaces are really shabby. They're really kind of grotty even in places. They lack love, they lack any investment, any kind of real kind of maintenance. We've got crumbling steps on the way down to the beaches. We've got seafront gardens which are literally overrun with weeds and nettles, and even at times with rats as well. We've got a bit of a problem in the summer months of rats on the seafront gardens in Southwold. The greens and the open kind of park spaces that we have in the town are generally all pretty wild. In fact, a couple of years ago, the town council said that they were adopting a policy of rewilding on some of Southwold's greens, which basically meant that the grass didn't get cut. But we have this obvious disparity then, this difference between the very well kept, very manicured and pristine almost private spaces in Southwold, and then in contrast, the really kind of shabby, unloved, unmaintained public spaces in Southwold. And some students actually like that idea of looking at the contrasting impacts of second home ownership on the environmental consequences in Southwold. And they do almost a study based around private versus public environmental quality. So that's one of the impacts that, as I say, is probably not particularly obvious from the increased amount of second homes, but it's definitely something which exists in Southwold. Economically, this is probably more obvious. The biggest impact of the increased second home ownership in Southwold has been, over time, a massive inflation of house prices and the economic impact that has on local people. For people that own property in Southwold already and are looking to sell, then actually it's not a bad thing. They can get a significant amount of money for their house if they're willing to move out to Southwold. But for local young people, I've got a couple of tutors that work for me locally. It's just not possible for them to buy a house within Southwold, or even within a radius of Southwold as well, because the house prices are so inflated. So that's one of the big negative impacts for local young people. From another perspective, economically, the town has had to adapt to this change in demographic structure. So a town's high street normally caters towards the people that live in that town. But actually, Southwold's high street would be kind of missing a trick, really, if it was trying to cater towards the 30% of people that lived here permanently. It's actually going to be far better, and better as a business, to cater towards the 70 to 75% of affluent second homeowners, or the people that are here on holiday. And that is what's happening on Southwold's High Street. So Southwold's High Street has had to adapt and has had to change in relation to what's going on with Southwold's demographic makeup. So Southwold's High Street now caters much more towards the affluent visitor and the holiday maker than it does towards the local older residents. There are still a number of local services. There's a hardware store, there's a couple of kind of basic bakeries and things like that. But actually, overwhelmingly, as you walk down Southwold's High Street, again, you get this sense of wealth and the impact of gentrification, because the shops and services on Southwold High Street are geared towards a particular type of person. There are high-end delis, there's lots of very nice kind of cafes, but there's also lots of high-end clothing stores and jewelers and galleries and antique shops, and shops that are obviously geared towards people that have got a bit of money or that are here on holiday. And so some students, and in fact this is a very popular thing for students to look at, it's looking at the identity and the change over time that's happened within Southwold High Street as a result of the changing demographic and the increased amount of second homes that we have in the town. Finally, and I've touched on this before, the social consequences of Southwold's second home influx has been pretty significant in terms of the declining permanent population and the consequential impact that has on local services. So Southwold's local hospital closed in 2015. The library is moving in Southwold. We have the United Reformed Church in Southwold, which is really dwindling in terms of its numbers. The Methodist Church actually closed in 2022. The police station, the fire station, we had a swimming pool at the primary school, which, by the way, has only got about 55 permanent students, and only 3 teachers. So the local services in Southwold are suffering, but also the community suffers as a result of there being a transient, non-permanent population. In the summer, the houses in Southwold generally are full, but they're full of people that are only going to be here for a week at a time. So actually generating a community spirit is really difficult. Doing things like, celebrating the Queen's Jubilee or something like that is difficult in Southwold without permanent population and without, a young population with the enthusiasm and energy to organise things like that. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, if you choose to visit Southwold in somewhere like November or January, outside the main tourist season and, in the depths of winter, Southwold can be a very strange place midweek and certainly midday. But actually, when night falls in Southwold in the winter months, it can be quite eerie. It can be quite a kind of a weird place to be, because streets that should be full of people in terms of residential streets in the evening when people are coming home from work, are actually abandoned and are empty, and there are no lights on in the houses in the evenings because people aren't living there permanently. So the community is definitely facing challenges, and this is as a result of the change and the movement towards increased second home ownership over the last 20 to 30 years. So hopefully that flow diagram has helped. It's in your booklet, so you can refer to it again. Okay, sorry about that. That was quite a long annotation, that last slide. I promise that I won't spend so long over one particular slide on any more of this presentation. I'm just going to quickly refer to these pictures on the screen here. I work in Southwold. I've got a connection with Southwold. I really like the town, and so I don't want to be necessarily negative about it. But in terms of the environmental quality of the public spaces, I just wanted to show you these pictures just to highlight that point that I'm making, that actually Southwold's seafront and a lot of the public spaces are pretty shabby. You can see the steps there are overgrown with weeds. They don't look as if they're particularly well maintained. There's cracks within them. The railings on the left-hand side there you can see are rusting away, and there's kind of flaking paintwork as well. And then on the left-hand side, you can see all the weeds behind the beach huts. And as I say, there were times in the past where we've had problems with rats running amongst those weeds and running behind those beach huts. And it's not a great look, really, as you step out onto Southwold's primary asset, the beach, to then see it backed up by these really overgrown and unloved seafront gardens. Now, in other places around the East Anglian coast and probably around the country where there are more permanent residents in coastal towns, those councils have got more funding to spend on maintaining those public spaces. So on the bottom of the screen there, you've got a picture of a place called Felixstowe, which is just south of us in Suffolk. And then on the right of that is a coastal town called Cromer up in Norfolk. And again, both of those towns have permanent populations that are significant enough to enable their councils to spend more money on their public spaces. And that's one of the one of these kind of hidden consequences of increased second home ownership, that Southwold Council is just lacking the funding to maintain the public spaces as well as they would like. Another thing that I think is probably worth me mentioning at this point is the website called DataShine. It's an absolute archive of wealth of maps, which will, I'm sure some of them be relevant to your studies. But one of the things that I think is really useful that DataShine offers is this thing called DataShine Commute. And DataShine Commute gives you the opportunity to see where people work or where a workforce comes from. So you can click on Southwold, for instance, and it will tell you where the workforce for people living in or working in Southwold comes from, and it will produce one of these flow line maps. You can't quite see it because it's kind of above my head here, but have a little play around with it, and you'll be able to produce a map pretty easily, and then copy and paste it into perhaps your introduction. But one of the things that you'll see if you click on Southwold is that a good proportion of Southwold's residents commute a fair way to work here. So one of the problems that we have with increased second home ownership and increased house prices is that actually the working community in Southwold doesn't live in Southwold, and at 5 o'clock or 5:30 every night they move away, and they're not contributing to the kind of the 24/7 community that most towns would benefit from. Okay, so again, this is in your booklet, and these are generally the themes that students base their initial thoughts on when they're designing their NEAs. So these are local issues, local human geographical issues that are all measurable, that are all relevant and evident in Southwold. And so I suggest that one of the things that you do initially is maybe you freeze the screen or you go to this page in your booklet and you think, okay, of these issues then, what is the issue that I'm perhaps most interested in? And then from that point, you then explore in terms of making it perhaps a question from that issue, and you try to kind of develop an investigation into that particular issue. So not necessarily mentioned adnams too much at this stage. Adnams are a major industry that are based right in the heart of Southwold. They've been brewing beer here for over 150 years, now make things like gins and whiskies and vodkas too. They have a significant influence on Southwold, and using kind of a geography term, they are probably the key local stakeholder. They have a very positive influence. They're an organisation which is seen as a real kind of asset towards Southwold. They do things like sponsoring the beach, for instance. They coordinate beach cleans. They also have a really positive community profit share scheme where essentially every year they contribute a proportion of their profits towards supporting local charities and local business ventures and community groups and things like that. It's called the Adnams Community Trust. And any business within a certain radius, I think it's about a 25-mile radius of Southwold, apply for funding from this community trust. And Adnams trust members meet and decide and determine who they're going to allocate funds to each year. And they then produce a report of the organisations that they've supported. You can perhaps look up from their website. But they benefit a huge amount of people and organisations through sharing out their profits. They're also pioneers in things like sustainability, reducing water consumption, but fundamentally they own some of the biggest and most significant assets in the town. The Swan Hotel, which you can see on the bottom left of the screen there, is, I suppose, Southwold's kind of flagship, or Adnams' flagship hotel. It's their kind of most prestigious one. It's undergone a recent renovation. It's really high-end, really nice restaurant, nice bar at the back of it, and really nice rooms, apparently. Not that I've been able to afford to stay in them. So they own a number of hotels in the town, a number of pubs, and they also own a large shop which sells a lot of their products and homeware and things like that, which has also got a cafe at the back of it. It's a big metal barn-like structure, probably one of the most popular shops in town, I'd have thought. So they are a key stakeholder, Adnams, and not only do they have a physical presence in the town, but they're also, I'd say, really important in terms of Southwold branding. They do a huge amount on social media, and they're extending the identity of Southwold broader. So they've got now Adnams stores in a number of towns locally, and actually even in London. And actually underneath their logo, as you can see on the screen there, is the word Southwold. So actually Adnams almost do Southwold's marketing for them, and they kind of help create this branding of affluence and success, and product of Adnams is very nice as well in terms of its branding. So they do a great deal in terms of promoting Southwold. Some of the other issues then, we've mentioned the gentrification issue a lot. So you might want to design a study investigating the impact of gentrification and how it's going about, and the evidence for it, how it might be impacting upon the identity of Southwold, or changing the community, or maybe the environmental spaces within the town. So there's a wealth of options to explore in terms of the impact of gentrification. That potentially leads on to a number of these others. Some students like the idea of actually looking at, who is Southwold for? Is it a place that is still a local town which caters for its local residents significantly, or is it a place that has become more of a kind of a holiday resort and an affluent destination for second homeowners and wealthy holidaymakers? This idea of change over time is something which is again a popular theme to investigate. We've got a real asset which I'll talk about a bit later, which a number of you will be able to tap into. It's a website called Southwold and Son, which has been put together over a number of years and is essentially a big archive of historical information about Southwold streets and how individual properties have changed their function and their ownership over time. So you can, for instance, look at Southwold High Street in 2022 by doing your own fieldwork. You can use this website to gain a real good perspective about what Southwold High Street has looked like historically, and what buildings and businesses were located on the High Street, and how then that has perhaps changed as a result of the increased second home ownership that's developed. Not mentioned too much about regeneration, but there are three really good examples of regeneration in Southwold, good because of their conciseness. They're all relatively small. The pier is a great example of a regeneration project which is appropriate to investigate. The pier has got a fairly kind of checkered history. It was opened originally in 1900 and underwent a period of kind of boom, like a lot of kind of coastal towns did in the early 20th century, but then fell into decline, particularly after the Second World War, and has since been bought by a private family and has been renovated, which is quite rare in this country to have a privately owned pier. It was reopened in 2001, and the following year was awarded the National Pier of the Year, and is overwhelmingly seen as a successful regeneration project, and definitely seen as a real asset to Southwold as a town. So it's a really good, concise example of regeneration. We've also got a regeneration project which is linked to Adnams. So Adnams' old kind of depot, their old industrial hub within the centre of the town, has been completely transformed. It's almost a bit like Southwold's version of Canary Wharf, an area where there are warehouses and there are industrial units which have been cleared to make way for a large-scale regeneration project, which is mainly residential, but does also include Southwold Adnams' main shop, as I've mentioned before, a cafe, and there's also a stationery shop there as well. So technically it's kind of a mixed-use regeneration project. Again, it's a concise area, and it might be a potentially good spot for you to look into for a regeneration project. And then finally, we have ongoing at the moment, about to reopen, is Southwold's Community Hospital. As I mentioned, it closed in 2015, but it's been completely redeveloped, revamped, and is a really good example of community-led regeneration. So it's actually been funded by a kind of a crowdfunding project, which local people have tapped into, including myself. So we've bought shares in this regeneration project. I think there are 380 people that contributed money towards this, and collectively they were able to raise enough money to fund this regeneration of Southwold Hospital, which is due to open in early summer 2022. And finally, the one that I've not mentioned yet, what is the identity of Southwold and how has it changed over time? So this is something that is, fairly debatable, really. Southwold isn't just this kind of traditional coastal seaside town. It's got lots of other angles to it. So you might think about, what is the main identity of Southwold? Is it a coastal town? Is it a brewery town? Is it used to be traditionally a fishing town? So you might try to establish what the identity of Southwold is, and look perhaps more a historically based study at how that might have changed over the course of time. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time highlighting some of the main areas in Southwold. This aerial image here gives you a sense of perspective and tells you where Southwold's High Street is. That's that faded white area that runs from left to right. Southwold High Street has got about 65 shops on it. You can see it runs in a straight line. It's probably about 7 or 8 minutes to walk from one end to the other. Shops on both sides of the road. And then eventually, above my head up here, you can see that it kind of forks. That's Southwold's Marketplace. There's a fork that goes on the left-hand side towards the beach, and there's a fork on the right-hand side that goes towards an area called Gun Hill, which we'll talk about in a minute. And there are shops on both sides of the road down both of those forks as well. Other things that are just useful for me to point out at this point as well, you'll be based in one of 2 different locations that we have in Southwold. The one that's just above the church there is our primary classroom. That's where we are mainly based in Southwold Arts Centre there. And then the other one just above my head is on the High Street. It's in a place called the United Reformed Church. And depending on what days you're coming will depend on which venue that we use, but you'll be in one of those 2 locations. So either one really is pretty close to the beach, probably about 2 or 3 minutes away from the beach, and also pretty conveniently located to the residential areas and the high street too. So it just gives you an idea about where you might be based from. These bits that have been highlighted now are showing Adnams' main locations. So the one in the middle of the screen is the brewery. The brewery is actually kind of over 2 or 3 different sites that's divided by a crossroads here towards Southwold's Lighthouse. To the right-hand side of that section that's been highlighted is the back end of the Swan Hotel, which is Southwold's main hotel and Adnams' main hotel as well. And then to the left of the screen, that's Adnams' shop down there, that big kind of metal barn. And behind the shop is a cafe, and then behind the cafe are 34 houses that were part of Adnams' regeneration project. So that's where that's located, just at the end of the high street. Worth knowing that Southwold has got a museum. That's also located on that street down to Adnams Brewery, called Victoria Street. There's also another museum, kind of a less official one, which is out on the seafront, called the Southwold Sailors Reading Room. That's worth knowing about. Perhaps more kind of coastal based, but it's perhaps worth knowing about. You can ask me about it if you want to find out where it is. But one of the things that I would suggest at this point that you do, maybe in advance of your trip, is search for this document on Google. It's called Southwold's Conservation Area, and a character appraisal report. And it's something which has been commissioned recently by Waveney District Council, our local council here, and they've put together a kind of a detailed report about Southwold's town. But within that report, there are different chapters that give background information about the different parts of Southwold. And you can see one of the pages within that document is that coloured map that I've got on the screen there. Or using that coloured map, I'm going to divide Southwold up into different zones and give you a bit more information about each zone. The first zone has just come up on a screen there. That's that zone that's kind of set back a little bit from the beach, not quite the seafront, which you can see is in yellow on that map, but it's a green zone with a bit of a random name. It's called the Seaside Corporation. But the Seaside Corporation is fundamentally a residential area. It says high quality, large terraced houses. This is what it says in the appraisal report. These were all constructed mainly in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So houses here at least about 120 years or so old. But a number of them are terraces, a number of them are kind of 3 or 4 stories. Pretty grand, actually, a lot of them, and these ones especially are pretty sought after. A number in the Seaside Corporation location will be second homes, very high density of second home ownership in this area here. So that's that zone, the Seaside Corporation zone. So it might be that you, rather than investigating all of Southwold, for instance, which might be a bit too big an area, that you actually pick one of these zones that I'm about to talk about. So Seaside Corporation is particularly a good zone for looking at in terms of gentrification change in recent years, and that's the location that it's based in, so kind of just north of the High Street, back from the front. The next zone, which is in the foreground of this image, it's kind of been shaded in a transparent pink colour, is a zone called the Seaside Suburban, and properties in the Seaside Suburban are a bit bigger and slightly different to the Seaside Corporation area, less uniformed, and a number of these have got bigger gardens, which you can actually see from this kind of aerial image looking down onto it. Now, these properties are mainly bordering onto Southwold's Common, so you'll hear some people referring to this area as the Common, but this is the zone that is south of Southwold's High Street. Generally, the buildings here are early 20th century, so they're a little bit newer. They're classed as fine detached villas, some of them, on the edge of the Common. So yeah, a number of these are detached properties. There are a number that are also still terraced houses, but a lot of them have large sweeping kind of panoramic views across the Common, and across and over the Common you can actually then see the coast to the south as well. So even though it might not look like they've got sea views, they can actually see the coast to the south. So again, a lot of these grand villas will command high prices and are very affluent and desirable. Marine Villas is generally a location that is known to most locals as Gun Hill, this area to the south of the High Street. If you were to take the right-hand fork down the High Street, it splits in the marketplace, and continue on that road, you eventually come out into a kind of an opening, broader area known as Gun Hill. So this area has been developed more recently. In the appraisal report, it says this is a substantial Regency villas built in the early 19th century in open grass landscape on and near the Gun Hill cliff top overlooking the sea. So yeah, a number of these properties have got the best views in Southwold. They were superior residences who were built for the Suffolk gentry, to the wealthy people, the kind of commanding, the powerful locals of that era would own and use these buildings. Some of them were for hire. Some of them were actually hotels. It says there that one of them, which is the one in the furthest right of that zone, known as Centre Cliff House, was at one point a hotel. So this was the posh end of a posh town, basically. And it's still the end of town which has got the highest house prices, probably the biggest average property size as well. And the beach huts here as well are some of the most expensive. The beach hut in front of Gun Hill at this point would go from anything from about £160,000 to £185,000. So actually a beach hut here costs as much as an average house would do in our nearest significant town, Ipswich. And that just kind of shows the affluence of this end of the town. Okay, Okay, at this point, I think it's worth me introducing you in a bit more detail to Southwold & Son website. I've spoken about this a couple of times in previous slides, but this is a real gem of a resource. It's a free-to-use website. It's not necessarily the most modern website, but it's one that's pretty easy to navigate around. That's the homepage that you've got on the left-hand side of the screen there. And your best bet is to probably just initially select a street from that drop-down option that you have. When you select a street, and I'm just about to select the high street, it will then pull up a page that looks like this. And one of the nice things about it is it gives you a kind of a street map, quite a nice, simple street map. So that's the street map of the high street. And you'll notice that all of the buildings are numbered, and most of them are numbered with a red number. If they're red, it means you can click on them, and you can click on any of those individual buildings. And the amazing thing about this resource is that when you click on those numbers, it then pulls up the historical details about that property in the past. So I'm going to click on this one here, which is actually the Fat Face building now. So it's a kind of a what do you call it? Art Deco style white building. So if you click on that, it then brings up a kind of a rainbow style grid here, and you can see by looking at that that rainbow grid gives you information about the historical ownership and function and use of that building over time. So it's actually been a Fat Face since 2008. Before that, it was something called Wards of Southwold, which was a furniture and furnishings shop, and it looked like it was a Wards furniture shop all the way back to 1945. Before that, in 1940, it was a hairdresser's, and it looks as if there's also been another couple of functions on it as well. So one of the great things about this website is you can actually look at how the function of individual buildings have changed over time. And one of the things that we're speculating and suggesting is that actually in recent years, in the last 20 to 30 years certainly, the high street has adapted to cater towards this more affluent holiday maker or second homeowner. So one of the things that you might use this website for is to look at retail change over time and how the function of the high street has evolved essentially over the last decade or last decades and century. Okay, at this point then, I think we're over halfway, so don't worry, getting through it. You might not want to watch this all in one go, it's quite a marathon, but this is the natural kind of halfway point where basically I've done the first bit, which is introduce you to Southwold's Human Geography. This second bit now then is to give you a bit more exposure, a bit more confidence about the types of things from a human geography perspective that you can measure in and around Southwold's town streets. Again, most of these are included within the booklet that you've got, so make sure that you've got that handy. So on the screen, at this point, we've got 16 different names of fieldwork methods, which are all methods that can be used in an urban landscape. Now, it's worth saying that these methods, some of them are traditional, some of them have been used for years, but some of them are much more recent and modern, and some are actually ones that we've developed ourselves. Now, data collection methods don't necessarily have to be ones that other people have done in the past and the ones that you find other people talking about on various websites. You can actually make your own. You can customize and create your own data collection methods, any kind of surveys, any way in which you can gather information or data on the issue that you're investigating is legitimate. So don't be afraid to make up your own version of a data collection method, or significantly tweak or adapt one of the ones that you're about to hear about. So you don't have to follow a kind of a step-by-step methodology that somebody else has already done before. You can completely make these your own if you like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these and hopefully briefly, not in too much detail and too much time, give you enough information so you understand what each of these methods are about. First of all, the property quality surveys are very similar to things like environmental quality surveys or bipolar surveys that you might have done before. The idea of a property quality survey is to try to gauge the level of maintenance and the quality of buildings within a certain area. So you have a spectrum of scoring, and on this instance we've got an example here showing a 1 to 5 spectrum. Then you have a range of criteria that are all assessing the quality of a building. So things like the quality of the paintwork, or maybe the tiling, or the windows, or the front garden, or the access. So you rate those things on a scale of 1 to 5, and you would need to think about where you did this, how often you were to repeat it, in different locations. And the other things that I've suggested along the left-hand side here is maybe taking pictures of each site that you survey. But ultimately, you'll gain a picture of what the property quality is like in Southwold. And generally, the property quality in Southwold is pretty high. It's pretty good. So what you might want to think about is maybe getting a context. So maybe you could do a property quality survey in somewhere else, maybe your local area, to use as a bit of a comparative, as a bit of a contextual comparison. It's worth knowing about, and in the book that I mentioned this, that both Courtley and Hoxton roads are probably the only two streets in Southwold that haven't really been gentrified. They're mainly council housing. Actually, they're mainly occupied by local people, so they're quite useful ones to go to. So you get a bit of a comparison between gentrified and ungentrified streets. What you might need to think about with this then is, how are you going to decide which streets you go to? Are you going to come up with some kind of sampling technique? Are you going to put all of the names of Southwold streets into maybe a random name generator and pick out the first 10? That's one way in which you could do it. But yeah, you might want to think about your methodology for this. And as I say, don't worry about tweaking some of the criteria, maybe even extending the spectrum of scoring as well. It might be that you do a scale of 1 to 10. Gentrification mapping is something which is a method that we've been using in Southwold. I'm not sure if other people do that in other locations, but this is a hub of gentrification. So one of the things that you can use your phone for is getting your latitude and longitude coordinates, your exact location of where you are at any given point. Now, I'll talk about this in the 4th video, where I talk about making GIS maps. But your phone has got the ability to exactly pinpoint your location, where you are at any given point. And one of the things that students do whilst they're doing their fieldwork in Southwold is they might do gentrification mapping at the same time as them conducting their other methods. So as they're walking around the town, wherever they see any evidence of what you could say is live gentrification, they make a note of where they are and they log their latitude and longitude of that location. And later they can then map the examples of live gentrification that they've seen and create something like you can see on the screen here. So what I mean by live gentrification is wherever you might see, for instance, a skip in a road, like you can see on the image above, wherever you might see a builder's van, there might be a portaloo in a road, there might be traffic lights, there might be scaffolding on a building, there might be drilling or banging that you can hear going on a building site. So wherever you see live building work happening or evidence of gentrification happening, make a note of that location, and then later you can map those live examples of gentrification on a street map like that to show, on the days in which you visited, this was the gentrification that's currently happening. Okay, the third one, holiday home mapping. Again, in your booklets, you've got the walkthrough, talk-through guide as to how to do this. This is quite a bespoke method to Southwold, but it's a way in which you try to map or highlight the extent of holiday homes in any given location, and we do this kind of street by street. So the methodology that we normally encourage students to do with this is that you take a street, so it might be, for instance, Hoxton Road. You walk along Hoxton Road from one end to the other, and initially you count up the amount of front doors that you can see. Those front doors represent the individual houses. Say you've counted 28 front doors, and then assume that there are 28 houses on that street. You can then walk back along the same street, and this time, rather than counting doors, this time you count up how many of those houses you've just counted, how many of them have got evidence that they're a holiday home. So how many of them have got a sticker on the window? How many of them might have a key safe on their porch, which is the type of thing that you perhaps get if you're renting an Airbnb or something like that. Often the keys are kept in the key safes. Some of them, it might be actually, this is a bit of a strange thing to say, but a lot of the houses in Southwold, like you can see on the screen there, have got big, what are called bay windows, kind of really tall windows that actually, as you're walking along the pavement, you can't help but look into some of those windows, and you can very easily see, by looking indiscreetly into the windows, whether that house is a holiday home or not, because very often the holiday homes are laid out immaculately, then with a spot of kind of clothing out of place, and very often they have kind of a welcome pack sat on the kitchen table waiting for the guests to arrive. Obviously, some of those holiday homes might be being used, and so it might not be possible to tell if they're a holiday home at that point. You might sense that a house that's empty you might be able to look through the window and actually see, oh, look, that looks as if it's ready for some guests to arrive. There are a number of different ways in which you can kind of make that assumption. It's obviously not completely accurate by just doing it visually. So one of the things that potentially you could do to enhance the reliability of this is go on Airbnb, Verbo, Booking.com, or any of the local letting agents' websites, try and actually work out on any given street in Southwold how many of those houses are holiday homes. And ultimately, what you should then be able to work out on a street-by-street basis is what proportion or percentage of the houses on those streets are holiday homes. So I wouldn't expect you to do this for the whole of Southwold, because that would take forever and certainly take a good long while. But it might well be that you choose 3 or 4 streets in a particular zone that you focus in on, and you try and work out the proportion of holiday homes in those 3 or 4 streets. But again, how many you choose to look at will be up to you. House price analysis, kind of linked to the other things on this page here. So house price analysis in Southwold would show, obviously, that this is a location where house prices are, really exponentially kind of inflated. So there are a number of ways in which you could kind of measure and gauge house prices in Southwold. Obviously, you can go and speak to estate agents in the town, or you can go and have a look at the house prices of the buildings that they're currently selling in their shop windows. That's one way of doing it. But also, obviously, there are websites, Rightmove, Zoopla, things like that you can go on, and you can get a huge wealth of information about the house prices in Southwold. Potentially, you might be able to organise to go and speak to one of the local estate agents. Maybe if this is something that your study is especially looking at, you could actually go and speak to one of the estate agents. Maybe you can speak to a local about house price change over time. But in terms of looking at house prices and how they have increased and changed over time, you'll find a huge amount of information online. But you might want to think about what else you could gather while you're in town. Just to kind of give you a bit of an example, there are places within Southwold, very small houses within Southwold, that over the last 2 or 3 years have seen their value increase, by as much as 20 to 25%. So there's a house on the screen here. This is just a 2-bedroom house which sold about 5 years ago for £360,000, and then sold 3 years later for an extra £120,000. So in 3 years, its value had increased, almost 25%, and that's pretty common in Southwold. So you could do that analysis by looking at the data that is available on Rightmove or Zoopla or somewhere like that. Just while we're at this point, I'm going to just basically quickly refer you to Southwold Council website. If you're looking at gentrification, this is just an extra layer of depth that you might choose to go on. Anyhow, the council have to meet frequently to discuss any local issues, including planning applications. So whenever somebody wants to extend their property, they have to submit a planning application, which then gets discussed at a council meeting. So the town council have to write down what's called the minutes or the notes of every council meeting that they have, and they also have to publicly document these notes, and they've got them on their website. So if you go onto the Southwold's official council website, click on the Town Council tab, and then click on the minutes bit at the bottom central part of that page. That then brings up a page that looks like this, which has got a huge list of kind of fairly uninspiring, boring-looking PDFs. But you can see the titles of those. It says council agenda, some of them say minutes and things like that. Well, if you click on those, eventually you'll be able to find, after scrolling down through those agendas, the point at which those council members started talking about planning applications. Number 5 on this document says planning matters. So each of these different bits of text here are the discussions that the council had about the planning applications that have been submitted that month. So the first one here says this person had submitted an application to have a roof conversion, new dormer windows installed, reconstruction of a 2-storey rear extension, an addition of a garden room to the rear, new windows, and some internal alterations. That was on 40 Victoria Street. So what you could do if your study is looking at gentrification is you could actually delve into the recent history of approved gentrification in Southwold by looking at the Southwold Town Council's minutes. So extra layer of depth that very few students would probably be bothered to go into. But actually, each week, each month, there's probably several, maybe 7 or 8 different planning applications considered. And one of the things that is useful is that they're always providing the address. So we know that 40 Victoria Street, this was something that was submitted, and you'll be able to work out when it was dated as well. So you might be able to produce a map, maybe again, there's something similar to this gentrification map, to show perhaps the approved gentrification alterations that have occurred in the last 12 months. You could make something like that. There'd be next to nobody else in the country that would be doing it. It'd be really unique, and it would show that you've really gone to an extra level of depth to show the extent of gentrification that's being approved in the Southwold. Okay, so the first one on this screen is something called a shops and service survey. Again, you've got this in your booklet. It's the type of thing that you could easily customize and tweak to suit your study. This essentially is just a kind of a snapshot of what's going on the high street. What we've got here as our example is a grid which is trying to define whether a shop or service on the high street is either geared towards tourists or whether it's geared towards local people. Again, it'd be up to you perhaps how you could choose to determine those different groups. It might be that you have different or further numbers of groups than the ones that we've used there. But in addition, you could use the Southwold and Son website to enhance this. Maybe you could look at what the picture was 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And this is the type of method that's quite useful for using for gentrification studies and how the impact of second homes has gentrified the high street and changed the high street over time. So this idea of retail change as well as relevant. Now, an extension to the shops and service survey, or perhaps maybe more of a scientific way of assessing the retail offer on Southwold High Street, it's something called a Clone Town survey. With this, I think you're probably best actually just searching on Google for Clone Town survey, and you get this form come up that's on the screen there. It's actually a form with 2 sides to it. That's the first side that you can see, and then there's a second side behind it, which actually kind of almost describes the methodology that you need to take to complete the survey. It's actually a really easy survey, which is undertaken by walking up and down a high street. You're expected to survey the first 50 shops that you pass, and the thing that you've got to do is try to categorize each shop that you pass into one of 25 different types, and that's what the kind of list of criteria is there. So you've got things like off licenses, you've got things like estate agents, food retailers, etc. And then the second thing that you should do is you should try to make a judgment as to whether that shop is independent or a chain store, and you kind of put your tally into the relevant grid then. Ultimately, when you've walked past 50 shops, there's then a fairly simple equation that you need to use your figures to work out, and eventually you get a score. You'll get a number that is between 0 and 60, and you can take that score and place it on the spectrum that you can see at the very bottom of that blue page, and it essentially tells you how unique the high street is or how similar it is to other high streets in the country. So it gives you what's called a clone town rating. Now, Southwold at the moment is a place that attracts people because of the nature of its high street being quite unique. There are a lot of independent stores in Southwold where there might only be one of those in the country, a particular shop where there's only one of them. And that attracts people in because it means that it's different to other places in the country. But increasingly, there are chains on Southwold High Street. There's a Tesco's, for instance, a WH Smith's. There are various kind of coffee and cafe outlets that are chains that have arrived in the recent years. So Southwold's kind of clone town rating is actually getting lower. The number that is generated is getting lower. So one of the things that you could do is you could do a clone town survey to work out what Southwold's clone town rating is currently in modern day. But again, potentially you could use the archive and the resources from the Southwold and Son website to maybe do a clone town survey based on 1990, maybe 1970, 1950. And you could actually look how Southwold's clone town rating has changed over time. And that's why this method is good for things like retail change over time, or again, the impact of second homes on the function and the identity of the high street. One of the things that you might want to think about here in terms of the reliability of this method, particularly when you're doing it, is how you actually gauge whether a shop is an independent shop or whether it's a chain store. Most chain stores are probably brands that you will recognise and you'll know about, but the independent stores, there might be a shop on Southwold High Street looks as if it might be unique, but how would you know that it's the only one? So, for instance, we've got a very popular bakery on Southwold's High Street called Two Magpies, and the original Two Magpies was in Southwold, but in recent years, because it's done so well, Two Magpies has now got, I think, 5 different shops in other locations around East Anglia. Does that now make that a clone town? A clone chain store, or is it still an independent store? So what you might want to think about and decide on, and it's up to you, is decide on your definition of what an independent shop is, and perhaps what the definition of what a chain shop is, because that's going to be important in terms of the reliability of your data for this one. Third one on this page is something called a footfall comparison survey. Really basic, straightforward, but really useful method. It's essentially a method where you're counting people. You've probably done things like pedestrian counts or vehicle counts in the past, which are still legitimate if they're relevant to your study. But a footfall comparison survey is just a slight tweak on that. One of the things that this involved then is essentially sitting or kind of propping yourself up somewhere where you've got a good view of the entrance to a shop, and all you're doing is you're setting a time period and you're counting the amount of people that go into that shop. That's what's called a footfall survey. Now, one of the reasons for doing this is you can look at, for instance, whether there's a significant difference between the amount of people that are going into chain stores or independent stores. So sometimes students might get 5 different types of shops, whether it's a cafe, whether it's a sweet shop, whether it's a clothing store, and they would try and identify an independent one and a chain one, and then they would look to see whether there is a difference between the numbers going into the chain one or the independent one. So the example that you've got in your booklets there is WH Smith's, which I'm sure you've probably all been in, mainly kind of classed, I suppose, as like a newsagent. Well, in Southwold, we've also got an independent newsagent called Chapman's. There's only one Chapman's in the whole country, and it's in Southwold. Unfortunately for Chapman's, about 10 years ago, WH Smith's arrived in Southwold, and they would literally direct competition almost directly opposite each other on the high street too. And so it's quite interesting to see whether visitors to Southwold support WH Smith's more because they perhaps know what they're getting with a store that they've probably been in lots of times before, or whether they're prepared to support the independent as well. So footfall comparison surveys are useful for studies that do things like that. If you're investigating, for instance, the pier and the success of the pier regeneration, this is a study that we're about to do in a few weeks with a GCSE group. One of the methods these guys are looking at is whether the services on the pier are as popular as the services on the high street. So on the pier, we have things like souvenir shops, and we've got cafes and restaurants. So they're looking at footfall into those shops on the pier, but then also comparing them to similar stores on Southwold High Street to see if there's a difference. And if the pier is getting greater footfall, you can confidently say that the pier then is being successful in terms of its regeneration and the offer that it provides to people. So it'll be interesting to see how those numbers vary. So that's something called a footfall comparison survey. Land use mapping is a kind of a classic traditional method of geography human data collection. There's something called a rice pot survey, which you might not have heard of before, depends on what fieldwork you've done previously. But rice pots is an acronym that spells out the main types of land use that you would expect to find in any urban area. And you can see there's a little grid there. You can Google this and find loads of different grids that have been made in the past. But rice pot stands for residential, industrial, commercial, etc. So you've got all these different zones. One of the things you could potentially do in Southwold then is you could get a base map. We've got some that you can use if you haven't got any that you're able to find yourself. You can get a base map of Southwold like the one above my head here. And then walking around the town, and maybe particularly focusing on a particular zone or particular area, you could try and complete a land use map of that area. And basically what this involves is colour coding the buildings or the streets on a key which is tied into this rice pots idea. So for instance, where you've got residential buildings, you might be logical to give that a red colour because the R for red and R for residential. And you would literally colour in any buildings within a zone that you're investigating red that are residential. Any industrial ones, so for instance things like Southwold Business Park or Hadnam's Brewery, you might give that a blue colour and you colour code that. So it's in essence it's a way of kind of creating a choropleth map where you colour code a base map based on this idea of land use. And you might be able to do that perhaps before or after your visit to Southwold. It might be that you can do that remotely, but you might enhance it, like I say here, by potentially taking some photographs during your visit. On the screen now, this is one of the things that, again, we're doing in a few weeks with a GCSE group. They're actually looking at land use on the pier. So their way of doing this is that they're actually they've taken a photograph of the pier, and they're actually just going to annotate that photograph to show how the land use varies along it and what different kind of uses there are of that particular space. All right, bit of a dodgy random one, this one. The first one on this screen is something called an age survey. So an age survey is, as I say here, good for trying to measure and gauge the identity of a place, maybe also looking at how the identity of a place may have changed over time. In Southwold's case, perhaps as a result of this influx of second home ownership. So an age survey is not something that I would necessarily suggest that you do by literally asking people. Probably one of the questions that you don't ever want to ask people is how old they are in terms of a questionnaire of the public. So this involves quite nicely finding yourself a bench, somewhere that you can sit down for a few minutes, and you're quietly trying to categorize the age of people that you can see using your given space into one of those age brackets. Now, it's up to you whether you choose to make those age brackets wider. You could have 0 to 10 and 11 to 20, etc. But the idea of doing an age survey is to try and gauge the identity and the makeup of the demographic that's using that space at any given time. So if you're looking at doing this for Southwold, you might want to think about then whether there are places where you may get a more reliable result than others. So on Southwold's High Street, your age profile of the people on the High Street are not necessarily the age profile of people living in a town. You might want to perhaps look at the residential areas to do your age surveys, because those are going to be more reflective of the residents of the town. So it depends on what you're trying to find and what you're trying to investigate. You might want to be looking at the profile of people visiting Southwold, and therefore perhaps doing your age survey on the High Street or maybe on the Prom would be appropriate. So you just need to think about where you'd get the results that you would consider to be most reliable for this one. A couple now to do with cars. Some of you might have a particular interest in cars. If you're like me, you probably don't. Well, you might not have any interest in cars. Might not know a lot about them, but some people do, and that's fine. And there's actually quite a lot that you can gauge and gather from just looking at the outside of cars, not least looking at the registration plate. You may not know, but vehicles all obviously have a registration plate, unless it's a personal registration plate that starts with a letter. And that letter represents the region in which that vehicle was first taxed when it was first on the road. So any vehicle with an A as their first letter of their registration plate conveniently tells us that that vehicle was registered either in Norfolk or Suffolk in the Anglian region. So Suffolk and Southwold is in the Anglian region. So our registrations for local vehicles always start with the letter A. So you'll notice as you drive into Southwold, if you're looking, loads of the vehicles locally have got A as their first letter. However, when you go into Southwold itself, you'll notice that there are loads of vehicles that haven't got A as their first letter, and that's because a lot of the people that are in Southwold are not from Anglia or the East Anglian region, and they're people that are visiting either their second homes or there as a visitor. So it's quite a useful way of actually gauging the extent to which there are local people to visiting people within the town at any given point. So one of the examples that you've got in your booklet here is a simple survey where by going through residential streets or car parks, you might choose 50 or 100 vehicles, and you're literally tallying the amount of those vehicles that have got an A registration plate and the amount that have got either a B to a Z registration plate. One of the things that you could do with the B to Zs is if you make a note of the actual letters that are on the non-A plates, is there is actually a grid. The DVLA, the national licensing agency, have got a list of all of these different codes. So your local area will have a code, and the vehicles in your area will be all start at the same letter as well. So what you could do is you could write down all the B's that you've got, all the C's that you've got, etc., and you could then produce a map that shows the locations around the UK where people are coming from to get to Southwold. If that makes sense. There's quite a bit that you could actually do with a car reg survey. One of the things that I think it's useful to just consider for this is that obviously people can sell their car, and you might have somebody driving an registration vehicle who actually live in Wales, and that's because obviously people can sell their car. And so to try and overcome that, you could perhaps just survey vehicles that are maybe 3 or 4 years old, because then it's more likely that the original owner is still the driver of that vehicle. Again, leave it up to you, but it's something that you could do as a nice little bit of information you can get by literally just looking at the registration plate of vehicles. Other things that you could do in terms of looking at cars is actually, if you make a note of the age of the vehicle by using the registration plate, and you make a note of the make and the model of the vehicle, you can actually go onto websites like Auto Trader and work out the approximate average value of that vehicle. One of the things that is pretty evident in Southwold, particularly in the summer months, is that there is almost this kind of influx of 4x4s, sports cars, big SUVs, and just really nice, obviously expensive vehicles. And so this is one kind of indication of Southwold's changing identity, that it's actually become more affluent, it's got more wealth obvious in the streets. And you can prove that by not just looking at house prices, but also looking at vehicle prices of the vehicles that are on Southwold streets at any given time. So there's a route that you could potentially go down there, again, using the information available on cars. Activity mapping, I'm briefly just going to mention this. Have a look at this in the booklet, because the majority of this is covered by my head. Activity mapping is whereby essentially you're making short, snappy statements about how people are using any given space. So, for instance, the high street or the prom, again, you find a bench and you're making just bullet point statements by observing people, their behaviour and what they're doing. So you're not necessarily writing anything personal about them, but you're maybe saying things like man and lady window shopping outside bakery, woman pushing pram, crossing road, people queuing up to use bank. So you're making snappy statements about how people are using a place. And then the idea is that you layer those statements either onto a base map or onto a base image. It helps you kind of retrospectively annotate maps or an image to bring it to life as to how that space is being used. Okay, the final set of methods here, I think. This first one on this last page is annotated photographs and field sketches. So I've mentioned on a number of the different methods. One of the things I definitely do as much as possible is take photographs of Southwold and the streets that you're investigating. But also, one of the things that you could come armed with to Southwold is some historical photographs of some of the key sites. So Southwold High Street, if you type that into Google or into Southwold and Son, dead easily you'll be able to find loads of archive old photos of that view. The one that I've got on the screen here is the view looking at Southwold Lighthouse as well, the prom, the pier. There's loads of views within Southwold where there are lots of old archive photos that exist. If you come armed with 2 or 3 of those when you come to Southwold, one of the things that you could do is try to replicate the same photograph but taken in modern day. And then, like I've got on the example there, is you could layer those next to each other on a page, and you could literally annotate the changes and the similarities that exist between those 2 photographs, even though they might be 100 years apart. So that's something called a past and present photograph comparison. So you could do that in terms of using your photographs, but another thing you could do is you could annotate your photographs, a little bit similar to how I was talking about the activity mapping. Or equally, if you're really keen on sketching, doing a sketch of your fieldwork location is just as legitimate as anything else, but as long as you annotate it. So an annotation is where you add a detailed label, basically, to your image to explain and to bring that image to life by offering perhaps a little bit more information. It might be that you're able to add some facts and figures in there as well. Like with that example on the screen, that's kind of bringing to life one of the cedar fences in Southwold by adding some explanation to that landscape. So they're just as valid a form of data collection as anything else. And I reckon pretty much most studies would benefit from having at least 2 or 3 annotated photographs in there. Environmental quality survey is very similar to the property quality survey, but it's a bit more specific by looking at environmental aspects of Southwold's landscape. So this is useful for looking at perhaps the negative impact of perhaps industry, such as Adnams, maybe looking at the variations between public and private spaces within Southwold. Again, you've got a set of criteria that you are scoring against a spectrum of 1 to 5, but again, you could customize that and make that more relevant to you. One of the things that's worth mentioning at this point, environmental quality survey and any kind of bipolar survey like this is quite subjective. And by that, I mean, it's quite opinion based. So it's your own perception that generates that score. So one of the things that you could perhaps do to enhance the reliability of this method is to back up your environmental quality survey score by doing something called a decibel meter. A decibel meter is something that you can get on your phone. All phones have got microphones, and they use the microphone to pick up decibel readings or sound level readings in your location. They're free on the Android and Apple stores. If you just type in decibel apps, you can download a free decibel app. You can perhaps let it run for a 1 minute or 2 minutes in the locations that you're doing these environmental quality surveys in, and it will give you a score as to how high the noise levels are in that location, and it might then be able to reinforce and back up some of the things that you're observing in your environmental quality survey. So it's worth thinking about downloading a decibel app if you're doing environmental based studies. Mood mapping is something that, again, is perhaps quite subjective, and some people sometimes consider this to be a bit vague. But I think actually with human fieldwork, it's worth saying that some of these methods are perhaps less scientific than the coastal physical methods of fieldwork, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not worth doing. It actually gives you quite a lot of things to write about in terms of limitations and reliability, which you get a lot of credit for when it comes to your latter part of your investigation. So this is one of perhaps the most vague and perhaps most criticised methods. It's something called mood mapping, and it's a way in which you try to gauge the atmosphere of a place. You might think, how do you do that? It's almost impossible. Well, this is something developed actually by, I think, American or Canadian psychiatrists who came up with this spectrum of 100 words that are all emotive words, that they said actually wherever you are, inside or outside, you could pick one of these words and it would sum up the atmosphere of that place. So it might be that it's kind of threatening or bleak or challenging if it's negative, or if it's nice and bright, it might be that it's kind of civilized and chilled or inspiring. So what we've done historically is we've selected 25 words from this grid, and we've made a condensed version of this, which is what you've got in your booklet. And what some students choose to do is they make their own version of this kind of mood mapping grid, have it out on a piece of paper, and they literally just ask members of the public to select either 1 or 3 of the words they think best fits the atmosphere or the mood of the high street or the prom or residential areas within Southwold. And they then just tally those up. And you can see on the screen again here below the colourful mood meter grid, there's one that a student has done in the past where they've kind of colour-coded with different depths of tones of blue the votes that each of those words got. So you can see the words just about that. The word pleasant there was one of the most popular, and relaxed was popular as well. So it looks as if those people were perceiving that place positively. So mood mapping is quite a nice way of getting some good qualitative data from members of the public about the location that you're investigating. Now, finally, not mentioned this yet, but you can obviously get a huge amount of information from social media as well. Going on things like Instagram and just typing in hashtag Southwold High Street will give you all sorts of pictures of what people are engaging with on Southwold High Street. And you could perhaps analyse those. Are there particular shops that are being posted about more frequently? Are there more posts involving independent stores or chain stores? Also, you can go on things like TripAdvisor. It's a great source of information in terms of what people not only like, but actually also sometimes dislike about a place. People are often fairly brutally honest on TripAdvisor, and it's a kind of a way in which you can tap into a forum where people are expressing their views about a place. So I would say that Twitter, Instagram, and TripAdvisor especially are 2 good sources of getting information from people without actually having to speak to them, which sometimes can terrify people, the idea of doing a questionnaire or an interview. Now, on that note, this last screen, I said the last one, I know, these genuinely is the last one. These are 2 methods that I've not spoken about yet. And I know that actually the thought of speaking to people that you don't know, members of the public, randomly in the street, is enough to terrify some people. Other people love it. Some people will happily chat away to people that they don't know without any kind of hesitation or kind of apprehension at all. But it is worth me mentioning these two because actually questionnaires and interviews can be absolute nuggets of information. You can get all sorts of great, contributions from people that you might not get if you were just doing your kind of set method. So if you do get the confidence, if you do feel, happy to approach people, then questionnaires are definitely still a really good, valued, legitimate form of data collection. But I would say that with a questionnaire, key thing that you need to think about, and very often students will ask me, is how many questions do I need in a questionnaire? Well, you've got to think about it the other way. So I would say questions in your questionnaire need to all be relevant to your sub-questions or your title. Now, it actually might be that you do a questionnaire where you've only got 2 questions or 3 questions. You might only want to be asking about one particular thing. You don't have to fill a questionnaire with 10 or 15 questions. You don't have to take 5 or 10 minutes time from someone's day. You can literally just take 30 seconds and say, would you mind answering 2 quick questions for my geography field study? So I would think about, first and foremost, any questions that you ask on a questionnaire, you've got to be convinced that they're relevant, that they're actually going to help you and they're going to benefit your study. So think about that first of all. So make sure that your questions are relevant and concise. Think about where you might approach people. So actually, although you might be investigating the high street, very often getting people to stop on the high street where they might be shopping and there with a purpose can sometimes be a bit difficult. So you might actually want to try and approach people that are sat down, maybe people on benches out on the Southwold seafront. There's loads of benches where people are often sat. It can sometimes be a good bet to access people there. And also, it might be that you approach someone, you're speaking to someone, and quite quickly you're aware that this person knows an awful lot, or they've got some opinions that they're quite happy to share. Don't be afraid to say to that person, would you mind me using the voice notes on my phone to record this conversation? Don't be afraid to actually allow someone to kind of go off piste a little bit in terms of their answer and, actually record that answer if they're happy for you to do so. And that lends itself onto this idea about interviews. So interviews, I suppose, in a sense, are kind of similar to questionnaires, but they're more about in-depth conversations where you're perhaps asking more open questions and expecting more extended answers. I would suggest that actually interviews are best maybe pre-organised, and it might be something that you are organised enough to do and confident enough to do that you actually maybe before your visit you might organise an interview with perhaps a shop owner, maybe the local librarian or somebody that works or lives in Southwold. You might go onto their social media page and send them a direct message and ask them to kind of, to commit to maybe doing an interview at a particular time on one of the days that you're here. But if you can do that, then you are going to get, really good information from the horse's mouth, really. So chap here, James on the screen, is an independent cafe owner in Southwold. Actually loves a chat, James. He runs as you can see, a cafe known as Nine Jelly. When he's not busy, James will talk for Europe. He loves a chat, and he might be the type of person that it's a good idea to try and arrange an interview with before your visit. As I say, just speaking for 10 minutes to somebody like that may give you so much information that's relevant to your study that it would be a real opportunity missed if you weren't to do it. So think about questionnaires and interviews. You can also go in small groups, maybe 2 or 3 of you could go. So if you're a little bit worried about doing it on your own, then it's the type of thing that you could do with others as well. All right. Okay, this is the final one, I promise. So you've got to the end of virtual video 2. You've also watched virtual video 1. You'd be delighted, I imagine, to know there's only one more video to come. That's called virtual video 4. I promise it's not going to be as long. You've got a huge amount of respect if you didn't press skip. If you watch that in one go, that's an unbelievable effort. I've watched it back myself as we've been doing it as well. Very conscious of my voice. I've been trying to vary it up a little bit. I might try and do virtual video 4 with an accent, just so it's a little bit different. But if you've managed to watch that from start to finish, well done. Apologies that my voice is kind of quite monotone, but I'll try and jazz it up a little bit. The dog arrived actually in virtual video 3 for the physical students who missed that. I was hoping that you might get a visit from my dog, but it's not made an appearance. Anyhow, I will see you for virtual video 4, hopefully very soon.